everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. What's the difference between a non-racist and an anti-racist? What does it mean to be racially woke? How do you overcome your fear of saying something wrong when talking to your African-American friends and colleagues about the racial reckoning in our country? How do you talk to your children about race and racism? These are just some of the questions white people are asking as they grapple with the racial injustice and inequality in America that now has people marching in the streets. Up next on Another View, Jonathan Zur and Dr. Jennifer Harvey, allies who will help us help white people understand race and racism. Stay tuned. Another View is next.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Immediately after the murder of George Floyd by a former Minneapolis police officer, people took to the streets in protest of police brutality and racism against Black people. And my phone started ringing. White friends, colleagues, listeners to our program, church leaders, all asking a variation of the same questions. What do I do? How do I help? Or the statement, I had no idea. I understand that it is confusing for those who have not faced the microaggressions, racial slurs, and sometimes downright hatred that African Americans face on a daily basis. So on today's show, a primer. Let's call it Racism 101. I have two excellent guests who work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for a living, and they are here to teach us all. Please welcome back to Another View, Dr. Jennifer Harvey, professor of religion at Drake University and the author of Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. Jennifer, we are so excited to have you back on Another View.
I'm so glad to be back. Thanks, Barbara, for having me.
You're very welcome. And Jonathan Zur, president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. And in full disclosure, I am a board member of the Tidewater chapter of VCIC. Jonathan, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Barbara. It's always great to be with you.
Thank you so much. So I know that I'm exhausted. So I imagine that you two are pretty tired too in terms of the emotional toll that this period of time is taking on all of us. How are you doing? Let me start with you, Jennifer.
Thanks for that. It's quite a moment, and I am tired, and I'm also kind of rejuvenated as well, watching all this young Black leadership emerge powerfully all over the country. So it's a lot, but and it's complex and layered, but I'm okay. Thank you.
Good. How about you, Jonathan? How you doing?
That it just feels like a really purposeful moment. It's also overwhelming and exhausting and candidly frustrating. Racism didn't start at the end of May, and yet it seems like there are a lot of folks who think that we were post-racial 10 years ago, and now all of a sudden we have these issues. And so I think this is an opportunity and a moment, and I'm inspired by the leadership, as Jennifer noted, and it's also a lot.
Yeah. And Jonathan, you bring up a good point because, Another View just turned 10 years old this year as of July and July 1. And, it feels like I look up and I go, really, people? When people go, I had no idea. I mean, is the bubble that opaque that people truly didn't think that there was still an issue in this country? Jonathan, why don't we start with you?
I think, Barbara, that some folks are really taught and socialized, especially, I think, white people, that racism is a series of acts by individual bad people. And so if that's what we've been taught, then what we see is if I don't call someone a mean name, if I'm not actively, consciously engaging in discriminatory behavior, then I can think naively that, or I could think prior to a few weeks ago, that I wasn't benefiting from or contributing to racism. And yet I think that one of the light bulb moments for white people is to understand that even if I am a good person, I can still be contributing to or benefiting from a system that grants advantage or privilege based on race. And so that's, I think, the big shift is folks have said, maybe I saw slurs here or there. I didn't contribute to them. I challenged them occasionally, but I was not aware of how this shows up in as systemic a way as a white person. Certainly our peers, our neighbors, our coworkers of color were seeing it and experiencing it all along.
I have to tell you guys, I really looked forward to this conversation and am enjoying this conversation because I get a chance to ask you some of the questions that people ask me. And from my perspective as an African American, sometimes they don't hear the response. And I'm hoping that by having the two of you, which if you haven't figured out by now, audience, Jonathan and Jennifer are not African American. So they are coming to the table as allies and as people who work in the space and who study the space and who understand the space, so that hopefully we can get a clearer understanding of what's going on. Jennifer, let me ask you about that opaque bubble also.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Jonathan that there's this sort of disconnect for many white Americans between individual sort of behaviors and systemic structures that even a failure to engage helps perpetuate. But in addition, I think the other thing white do is we kind of choose ignorance. And so what I mean by that is that, most white Americans, I think, don't, for example, read and prioritize reading Black and brown journalists, Black and brown writers, engaging Black and brown media. Even if after a moment like Ferguson or, after all the other killings that have happened since 2014, for a moment, white Americans might kind of wake up a little bit, but then we go back to sort of business as usual because we don't prioritize. Anti-racism takes a concrete commitment to prioritizing justice work if you're a white American, because just engaging in mainstream day-to-day anything is to engage in whiteness. And so there's kind of a ignorance that we don't even know we're choosing, but we've got to recognize we've got to actively choose against the insulation and ignorance that just sort of comes our way if we just sort of do business as usual in white Americans when you're, kind of systemically located, quote unquote, on top.
Yeah. And that leads me to a question that I have, because everybody is saying, or a lot of people are saying, that this time it feels different. And this time it's going to make a difference. The conversation in the African American community is perhaps, but we're watching, because the tendency is for everybody to get all riled up with the protests and with everything that's going on. And then when they get tired, they go right back to the same old thing. Is it different this time from your perspective, Jennifer?
It feels different in a way, in that I do think, like, I live in Des Moines, Iowa. Iowa is a very white state. I'm seeing more white people in the streets than I've seen before. I think years and years of the movement for Black Lives, having worked at the grassroots level all over the place without getting the visibility and attention it's getting now, has helped create a tipping point. I think because I think that work has changed in a very slow way some consciousness among some white people in some spaces. And we're seeing in this moment some of that manifest, combined with sort of, I think, the ongoing atrocities of this federal government and the crisis of COVID and all of that. Having said that, I have no illusions about how much staying power white people have. And so I think those of us who are really committed to this work, especially those of us who are white, committed humans, really have an obligation to keep sort of looking around who's showing up right now and how do I make sure I help them stay showing up. Because like at Des Moines, Iowa, police are getting more and more brutal right now. The more white folks tend to kind of drift away from the leadership that Black and brown youth are showing in the city right now. And so it's just this moment, I don't know what's going to happen. I do think something's different, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to, accomplish what needs to be done. So we've got to keep the white folks engaged. Okay. Jonathan, is it different? What do you think from your perspective?
It feels different in the moment, but I would agree that I'm cautious. There have been some conversations that I've had in the last 5-6 weeks that I haven't had in 11 years of being in my role at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. I had a head of a local bank reach out last Friday and say, I want to partner with you on a 3-year engagement to really think about culture change. That's never been a request. Usually my colleagues and I are the ones who are having to say, well, we need to do more than a 90-minute workshop. How do we turn this into a sustained commitment? And so I think that's an opportunity. I also think one of the things that right now is an opportunity, but also a challenge is it is easy to look at the video of the killing of George Floyd and say that is an awful thing. And as a white person, I am standing against that. Mm-hmm. When the mirror starts to be held up to me and my behavior, certainly not as egregious as what we saw in Minneapolis, but that might be contributing to benefiting from a system of privilege and advantage, that's when it's going to get much harder. And so I haven't seen that fully show up. And I think that's where white folks having to really look in the mirror and say, what am I doing? What am I committed to changing? What might I have to give up in terms of my sense of self, but also tangibly? That's where I think we're going to have some more pushback. Mm-hmm. And so that's what leaves me still a little bit skeptical.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We would love to hear from you with your questions about what it means to become an ally, about what it means to figure out where you stand in this racial climate that we are in today. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Let's go to the basics for a second. And Jonathan, I want to get you to do this, answer these questions. So give us the definition of racism and racist. What does that mean? Because I think a lot of people confuse things, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about.
Absolutely. I think that the definition that I use, and it draws from lots of folks, Beverly Daniel Tatum among them, mm-hmm. thinks about racism as being a system of power and privilege. And so that changes then an understanding, again, from the individual acts of meanness, Peggy McIntosh talks about and others, to really thinking about it in terms of who gets pushed up and who gets pushed down. So, Barbara, I can be mean to you. You can be mean to me. Mm-hmm. The consequences of that are different in society because of the system of power that exists. So I, as a white male, will have fewer consequences than you as a black woman would have if a person in a position of authority said something that was hurtful to one of us. Mm. And so I think that's really the shift in terms of our understanding that there are things that folks can do that are not nice to one another, but we're talking about the more systemic issues when we're talking about racism. And then racist, I think, builds on that. So what are folks doing that are contributing to or benefiting from this? And that's really the pivot. And Ibram Kendi and others, he has a book now, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where they really make a distinction between being non-racist, the naive thought that I can just remove myself from this system, or being actively anti-racist, fighting against it. And I think that's where the push is really moving right now. Yeah,
because those were going to be my next two terms, the difference between non-racist and anti-racist. Jennifer, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think Dr. Tatum's metaphor, too, helps illustrate it. Dr. Tatum talks about thinking about racism like one of those people movers in the airport, right? So we're all on it. It's moving mm-hmm. us, and it's in a racist direction. And so even if we're standing still, being passive is also a form of racism because the system is moving whether we move or not. The only way it can be anti-racist is if we're, running against the direction of the people mover in the airport, actively running against it. And then I would add learning how to actually dismantle the people mover to begin with. So I think that analogy for me is really helpful for visualizing the active running against the system required for anti-racism.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call. Give us a call and let us know what's on your mind as you try to navigate this new normal, this new pandemic, this racial pandemic that we find ourselves in as we try to figure out how to change systems and policies to make this country more equitable for everyone. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So let's talk about the P word, privilege, because you say privilege and people's hackles go up. The defensiveness goes up immediately. And my question to both of you is, what can we do? How can we have conversations about privilege without the defensiveness? Because you can't get the concept across because people are so defensive.
Yeah.
Jennifer,
Yeah.
you want to start that one?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I don't know the answer because different folks manifest defensiveness for different reasons. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's anger, sometimes, who knows. I find it's helpful for me to really try and give concrete, especially local historical examples of how systems have impacted people's lives, sometimes even before I use the word white privilege. Not because I'm afraid of talking about white privilege. We have to talk about it. But I think sometimes telling the real concrete stories that folks really just can't argue with from a factual basis can help. And so I've watched my students, for example, who might flee from the word reparations, which is something I teach and I'm deeply committed to. But if I don't use that word first and I start by showing them how the Social Security Act unfolded in Black lives versus white lives back in the 30s and 40s, or the Federal Housing Authority acted, then they start to go, oh, wait a second. And then we can put a label to privilege to that sort of inequitable access that white communities have gotten. Sometimes I find that is helpful. Okay.
Jonathan, though, when you do that, and Jennifer just brought up some really good examples of how privilege manifests itself, but the pushback I get when using those types of examples is, yeah, but that was then. It's not happening now.
Yeah, I think there are lots of points of pushback. I mean, the other piece that I think is important here is when folks think about privilege, I think white people in particular are often conflating race and other aspects of identity. So I can have a significant negative experience in my upbringing based on class, for example. So I can come from a low socioeconomic class. I don't feel anything about my life. Might be experiencing that word privilege. And yet what it means when we talk about it from a diversity, equity, inclusion space is that it's not that your life hasn't been hard, it's that your life hasn't been made harder based on your race. And so we're not talking about the fact that you've had a perfectly easy life, that everything has been handed to you on a silver platter, but it does mean that race hasn't been one of the factors that has been hurtful to you in the way that it has been to others. So I think that's the first thing, is really being clear on these terms in the same way that folks may understand racism to be different than we discussed earlier. I think there's a real misunderstanding of privilege. Now, once folks get that distinction, if they are still feeling defensive, or if they're saying, well, I didn't do it, or it's not, or you're making me feel guilty, or I wasn't there then that's worth some further interrogation. So one of the things that I tell folks a lot when I'm facilitating workshops around these issues is that if I learn about an injustice and my immediate instinct is to make it about me, I feel guilty. I feel badly. It's not about me. Why are you putting me on the defensive? Then I'm taking the focus away from where it actually needs to be. Why are you focusing on yourself when you've learned about an injustice that exists in society? And so that in and of itself is an example of having privilege, of being able to deflect, to get defensive, to feel guilty, rather than to actually do the work of understanding it and fighting against it.
So what do you say to people who say talking about race perpetuates racism? Which one of you wants to take that first? Because I've heard, people have said to me, and they've said this about our show, the fact that you talk about race, you are creating and continuing racism. Jennifer?
Well, I mean, what I say, quite frankly, is, that's like saying, talking about, let's say, climate change makes climate change worse. I mean, I can't even fathom how we think talking about something that is a real lived experience, specifically racism, as that connects to the conversation about race, or white supremacy as that connects to the conversation about race, how talking about that makes it worse. What I understand is that white people, some of whom don't, recognize racism is a pervasive, daily, violent experience that communities of color live with on an ongoing basis in this nation, might, sort of through that chosen ignorance, think that is the case because they think that, well, racism is a problem of not liking each other. So if we just stopped emphasizing our differences so much, it would all just go away.
Right.
But it's just, it's very difficult for me to even understand that mindset, just because I think we should be able to talk about anything that's a pervasive social experience for our communities, our cities, our nation. And so, there's no way to engage and challenge and change racism for the sake of racial justice if we don't talk about race in deep, authentic, and ongoing, meaningful ways. And we can do that, even if those of us who are white are sometimes afraid of that. And so I just sort of, have to out of hand sort of reject that position, even though I understand why some white Americans could still think that, racism isn't real, because we sort of live in these bubbles, some of us.
Exactly. Our phone lines are lit up, so let's go to the phones. Michael joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Michael. You're on the air.
Ma'am, I think that we have to capture the heart of the white man. When I look at how Trump got elected, when the nation had a chance to put its first white woman in office, it was white men pissed off at putting her in office, and white women followed their lead. And so, to me, we're not going to get anywhere unless the white man in America feels that he can be friended by the average black. And as long as there's people stirring up the pot against that, then it's going to be hard for us to be friends, so to speak.
Okay, Michael, thanks for the call. We appreciate that. Jonathan, you want to respond?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of motivations as to why folks voted the way they did in the 2016 election. I do think that
I think moving more to his point, though, about winning over white men in this race conversation will help move the needle. Is what I took from his overall, even though he put it in a political context.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that there is an important focus on how do we engage different populations of folks. So one organization a few years ago reached out and asked if I would facilitate a series of focus groups for white male employees, because they found that in their organization, when they were doing employee satisfaction surveys, white males were rating their diversity and inclusion efforts lowest among their employee groups. And they said, unless we can get this population, which in that organization was the majority of their employees, to buy into this work, we're not actually going to be successful. On the one hand, I get that. And actually, we were able to get some really important input that helped to drive some changes at the organization. On the other hand, that's putting time and money and resources into a population that already has the advantages. And so I think there are some questions about how much time and energy do we put into white men, white folks in general, compared to really centering the experience of those who are most marginalized, most aggrieved, most impacted by racism.
It's interesting because I think from an African-American perspective, as you talk about power, clearly white men still in this country control the power or have the power ultimately. And the feeling is sometimes that if we could get them to turn around, then the policies would start changing. Then we could start changing the systems and the institutions and so forth. But without their buy-in, that it will never happen because it'll just continue the way that it is now. Jennifer, are you there? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, now we can.
I guess I want to throw in response to this set of questions. I mean, we do have to put resources and education into building capacity and changing the minds of not just white men, but white women. I mean, white women did not just follow white men in 2016. White women are sometimes, anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But I want to say, I think we have to be organizers in addition to thinking about the education problem, because the fact of the matter is, if there are white men, Jonathan's among them, who are on this train already, and if we could get all of the folks who have intellectual commitment towards equity and justice to actually activate in our various organizations, to link arms across the aisle, so white women to stand with and behind Black and brown women in our workplaces, we could actually sort of organizing together, if more of us were activated, we could actually sort of change the power quotient. And so I don't believe we can nor should wait for white men to get it, or white women for that matter. I think those of us who have these commitments and who are not, in concrete ways every day, showing them and living them and sort of focusing on changes in our local context, if we could do that together, like white men are not the majority of the population. And
that is true.
I really believe in organizing, and I really believe in organizing in local context to just change the power equation. But that takes those of us with equity sort of commitments in our minds realizing, oh, I actually have to do something with others.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're unpacking race and racism and how white people can make a difference with Dr. Jennifer Harvey, author of Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America, and Jonathan Zur, president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, of which I serve as a board member for the Tidewater chapter. Let's go to Renee in Hampton. Thank you, Renee, for joining us.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's interesting that you were just talking about this because one of the things I wanted to bring up was this new dynamic. Well, it's not actually a new dynamic, but it's now a more recorded dynamic of white women knowing that they can do whatever is necessary to call a policeman or a person in power, and that person is going to automatically believe them. I'm thinking about, of course, the incident in Central Park in New York, and then there was another incident that a white woman called called the police on a family in Montclair, New Jersey, and white women are pulling guns on African American women and girls, and it's. I'm just thinking about what are some of the mindsets as it relates to white women and how they feel that they're maybe not being inherently protected. Everything, the mindset seems to be, oh, I'm so afraid. There's this perception of fear. So I just wanted the panel to kind of address what is this phenomenon that we are now seeing recorded more. I'm not saying that it is anything new.
Got you. Thank you, Renee, for the call. Who wants to take that one first? Jennifer, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I appreciate the caller naming, like, even if we're sort of noticing it more now, it's certainly not new. And there's some amazing work being done on by Black scholars on who were active, enslavers, right? And so this is an old phenomena where white women have been just as complicit in supremacy from the very origins of this nation state. And I think it's also the case that gendered, racist tropes and language and all kinds of systems where, going way back in our nation's history, fears of the Black male were used, conjured up fears, right, to invoke white womanhood as a way of, furthering white supremacist violence against Black and brown communities. But having said that, there's deep gender dynamics here, of course, in that ideology. We have to appreciate that talking about white women being active agents in furthering racist structures, that doesn't mean that white women don't still experience sexism. But I think sometimes in the context of thinking about justice education, the ways white women focus on sexism, for example, have allowed us to skirt the reality that we have been active participants in the very structures that are, harming our colleagues of color, our neighbors of color, et cetera. And so that's part of what we're seeing here. And that's part of what happened in 2016, too, is we just have not really gotten very serious about recognizing white women are in no way, shape, or form exempt or necessarily further along when it comes to the question of racism and anti-racism.
And Jonathan, when you think about the Central Park incident and others that have happened, again, that is in my mind, a true example of privilege, because she didn't say there is a man threatening me in Central Park. She said there is an African-American man.
Absolutely. One of my big fears about this moment and many other moments is that folks learn the right things to say without actually internalizing and making a long-term commitment to anti-racist action. And so folks have learned over time, and I imagine in this case, the perpetrators of these actions in Montclair and New York City and others, have said, well, I voted for Obama, or I volunteer in my community, or people will say these ridiculous, I don't have a racist bone in my body, these sort of tropes or phrases that folks use. And yet they know how to say those things. They know how to say the right things. They know what not to say as well. But in moments when they can use their advantage, they still seem to act on it and know how to act on it. And so I think we have a real risk of only teaching folks what to say and not to say, but not actually committing to the ongoing work that's both self-focused but also community-focused.
Jennifer, I want to ask you because you did write the book Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. Your daughters have been to marches and they've been engaged. How are they doing first? And what do you want to say to white parents who are really confused about when they should start talking to their kids about race, or if they should even discuss race with their children? Let's go down to the basics there, because a lot of them don't discuss it at all.
That's right. My children are doing wonderfully. Thank you. They've been saddened and sort of energized, sort of, they care kind of way in the last month and a half. But as you note, that's not new for them. I want to say to parents, we can and must engage our children from the youngest of ages in these conversations, both talking about race explicitly with them immediately, like before they even know what language is. And more importantly, those of us who are parents now who feel confused about how to do that with our children and what to do with our children, I want us to notice that the reason we're confused is because nobody did it with us. And so I actually don't want to bequeath that confusion onto my children. I want my children not to spend their 20s wallowing in white guilt or not sure how to be anti-racist agents in their lives, as I did. I want my kids to be partners with me in learning about anti-racism from young ages, that they know, and I think they know this already, they're 9 and 11, that being white does not necessarily equal being explicitly committed to racism. You can actually choose anti-racist behaviors as a white person, and that you can actually learn how to do that. And so the only way to raise children who are equipped for diversity and equipped to be anti-racist participants in this society, as we all need to be doing, is to just get going on it very, very young. And so my kids can have conversations about race now at ages 9 and 11 that I was not able to have until I was about 28. And so, and actually doing that, many white parents would say we want our kids to have interracial friendships, we want our kids to be able to function well in diversity. The only way to enable that is actually to start that racial education very, very young, because that's what Black families, for example, do, because they have to for the sake of their children's, survival. And so that's our part in this work for those of us who are parenting, is to just get going early with our kids. Even if we don't know what to say, we might be learning with them as we go, because most of us have so much more to learn, myself included, as I'll be learning for the rest of my life.
It's interesting. There was a part in your book, and I just kind of skimmed through it again. I read it the first time when you were on, and today this page just literally popped open at this point. But this was when you had told your daughters that they could go to a march with you. You asked them, did they want to go? And they said yes, and they wanted to do a sign themselves. And I think she was 7 at the time, wrote "Black Lives Matter. They matter the same as white. Stop killing them." And then she says that people that are Black are, and she names her cousin, another cousin, and her aunt. And how that affected you. But what struck me was something that you wrote where you said that you had never explicitly said to your daughter, your aunt and cousins are Black, and police violence against Black people puts their lives in danger. I had never yet made the connection explicit for her. In retrospect, I wouldn't still. My parental sense, at least with my kids and at that age, is that doing so would be too intense as a direct teaching. And it made me think about my experience in raising my daughter at that same age, and I had to have that conversation with her and be that explicit, and so it's just it again shows the difference in where we stand in society, and how on the one hand it's education for both, but one is an education almost for survival too, if that makes sense.
Indeed, yeah. I would just say it's not before that age explicitly talked about police violence against Black and brown people with our kids. We had done that. What I had not been explicit about is, your cousin who is, one of your daily playmates who is beloved to you, he's at risk. And the intensity of that, first of all, I didn't want her saying that to him, right, in a way that a 5-year-old might. And I also didn't want her, I wanted her to start to learn about the reality of anti-Black violence, in kind of that 5-year-old appropriate way, but without then thinking, oh my gosh, my actual cousin, I might wake up tomorrow and find out he's been shot. That was sort of, she still figured that out by the age of 7 because of how clear we were about racism.
You got some very smart kids. That's the bottom line.
Well,
so I want to ask the two of you, what exactly is an ally, and how can a white person become an ally? Jonathan, let me start with you.
Yeah, there's been actually a lot in the last few weeks, and probably longer than that, but I've certainly seen more and more articles that are critiquing that phrase as a focus or as a priority. And I think part of it is that ally has been claimed as a noun rather than a verb. And so folks that are able to say, well, I'm an ally, and think that they are done with their work, rather than recognize that true solidarity, true allyship would be an ongoing commitment to self-work, to analyzing where I may contribute to part of the problem, but also really working in tandem with and partnership with, again, those most centered or those most aggrieved. And so I think there's really important work for white folks to do. And you named it earlier in this conversation, Barbara, that unfortunately the reality is that white people often hear these issues differently coming from a white person than from a Black person, Indigenous person, person of color. And so I think there is a responsibility that I feel to hold other white people accountable, to hold myself accountable. But that is the practice, I think, of ongoing allyship versus saying, I'm an ally, I'm with you, tell me everything that you want me to do. So I take all responsibility out of myself. And also, I'm not going to continue in doing the ongoing work. I put the badge on, and that's all I need to do.
Got you. Jennifer, same question to you. What's an ally, and how do you become one?
Well, ally is a verb. I agree with Jonathan. It's also a description that only people of color get to ascribe to white folks if they decide to do so. So I never claim that for myself.
I called you an ally because I think you are. But
well, I appreciate that, and so I take that in. I take that. I appreciate that. But it's just something white folks should not be claiming for ourselves because, it's sort of like the communities most affected by the work we do are the ones that get to determine whether it merits a particular positive description. And then the other thing I would say, an ally, in the verb sense, if you walk up to me and you say to me, tell me the X number of things, concrete, material, justice-oriented changes on the issue of race that you are working on in your life with others, I should be able to give you a very specific, concrete set of answers to that question. So, like in my own life, I think, okay, I have this many hours a week to work, this many to exercise, this many to whatever. What are my hours? Like that concrete. Where do I spend my volunteer hours? With whom? Where's my money going? What in my workplace am I working on concretely right now to change the racial climate in my institution? Can I say those things in the concrete? And if I can't, that's a problem because then I am not activated as an anti-racist committed human. And so all of us who are white can be doing that, whatever our workplace or whether we are primarily at home working or whatever the context. What are the spheres of my life that I have influence in, and how am I moving the needle for racial justice in concrete ways? I can't do all of the things,
right,
but I can do something all the time, and we each can be doing that. That, to me, is the question of whether I'm activated.
Okay. Mary joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Mary. You're on the air.
Hi. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
It's going to make me cry saying this, but I'm not saying this as a way to get out of anything, but it's difficult for me to understand my white racism when I was bred as an officer's daughter, an American traveling in Europe, and of middle class. It's hard to know where all those issues begin and end and how to continue to work on the white privilege that is just overwhelming and needs to be separated from those other areas where I also learned privilege.
Let our guests kind of work with you and give you some suggestions. Jennifer, let's start with you. What would you tell Mary?
Yeah. So I would say, Mary, first of all, we all inherited this system. And so I really feel some empathy with that in terms of how overwhelming it can be to realize, I may have thought X, Y, or Z about my own personhood, and yet I had ancestors who did things I would utterly reject, and yet I still benefit from them even if I don't want to. And so that is a hard emotional recognition. And I think the other thing I want to offer, I've been learning so much from it's Resma Menakem, I may be mispronouncing his last name, his book, My Grandmother's Hands, this beautiful, powerful book about how all of us have inherited racial traumas.
Yes.
And so the white part of that is to dive deep into this work so that we cease adding Black and brown people's traumas because we are re-traumatizing them because of the traumas of white supremacy that we have also inherited. And so I just want to sort of encourage Mary that it's hard for all of us, but we have to start. We have to stay with it. We have to recognize that emotion is of course going to show up, and keep sort of trying to understand where the emotion of it is coming from, and just know that we're not alone and keep taking steps to learn more, even if it hurts, because we have all been hurt by this system, and we are only going to move through it in powerful ways if we continue to work with it, even when it's very difficult.
Absolutely. Jonathan, what would you say to Mary?
I would echo a lot of what Jennifer said. I think a big part of this is to recognize that if I've had experiences, and it sounds like Mary has, of feeling like the other, that's a window into being doing the work of allyship. So rather than say, I don't understand, or I think one of the things that she didn't explicitly say, but I've heard from a lot of folks, is I really thought I was a good person, or I really thought I got these issues, and now all of a sudden I realize I didn't get it in all the ways that I thought. And so I think that's a call to action rather than a moment to say, well, I'm overwhelmed by it or I'm uncomfortable with it, and so I'm not going to do the work. I would encourage Mary to really think about how the sum total of her lived experiences gives her opportunities to better understand these issues in a U.S. context, but also in a global context.
Mary, the book, My Grandmother's Hands, Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, says that my grandmother's hands will change the direction of the movement for racial justice. And this groundbreaking book, therapist Resma Menakem, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, examines the damage caused by racism in America from the perspective of trauma and body-centered psychology. So reading, talking with others, getting connected is the way to go in order to make a change. We appreciate your call. I want to ask both of you, because I'm just curious, why are you in this space? I mean, did something happen in your life? What made you decide that this is what I need to do? This is what my life's work needs to be about. Let me start with you, Jonathan.
Thank you for the question, Barbara. I think from early upbringing, I had from my parents a real sense of sort of fairness and justice. So my father's parents were Holocaust survivors. My mother's experience kind of growing up with some experiences with food insecurity and experiencing some poverty. I think that those experiences in terms of lessons that I learned helped to provide some vocabulary and some care. Mm-hmm. For me, I think a lot of this grew, though, and came to life through relationship. And so as I started to build relationships outside of my immediate circle, particularly with folks who were of different racial, ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds, I started to hear things and notice things. And once I saw them, I really couldn't unsee them. And so for me, that became a real commitment to volunteer, to stand up to injustice. And then ultimately that's evolved into professional work. But I think it still draws from some of the messages, some of the stories, some of the lessons I learned as a young child.
Can you talk about any of the things that you may have seen or specific that really made you go, as a young adult or whatever, that I've got to do something about this? Do you remember? Does anything stand out in your mind?
Yeah. So I was 15 years old. I went through a high school leadership diversity retreat program, similar to some of the ones that we now offer at BCIC. And being in a cabin with, so I grew up in central New Jersey in a suburban, white, upper middle class area. And I was in a cabin with folks from Jersey City and from Newark and from Asbury Park and from other places whose lived experiences were so markedly different. And hearing some of their stories about interactions with police or what the environment was at their school, I think was really powerful and compelling at 15 years old. I didn't know what to do with the information at the time. I didn't have a way to necessarily act on it. But I had a clear sense that it wasn't right and that I had a responsibility to do something about it.
That's fantastic. Jennifer, why are you in this space?
You know, my upbringing was completely different. I grew up in what I would call the beast of white conservative evangelicalism. But I also was in Denver Public Schools when we were under a desegregation mandate and so had busing. So my earliest friends were Black, mostly Black girls, not in my neighborhood, but in my school. And somehow I put the messages together. I noticed that racial tracking had happened by high school. I didn't know what it was, but I knew something was not right. And I also had this deep conservative God is love belief that in my college experience, still in white evangelical culture, I started going, wait a second, something's really wrong. And somehow found my way to read the work of James Cone, who's the father of Black liberation theology. He passed away just 2 years ago. And James Cone, from him, I learned God is love means God is a God of justice. And if God is a God of justice, God has to be Black. And for whatever reason, it just, I was like, oh, and my K through 12 experience, that was white supremacy at work. And basically at that point, I ended up in a seminary context in Union Seminary in New York with all kinds of amazing African-American scholars and activists and leaders, and embarrassed myself for a long time by saying things like, well, I believe in the Black Jesus. And those folks there would say to me, well, good for you, but did you notice that you're not Black? You know, and that community in my 20s just gave me a call that I've been trying to work out in the world in my life ever since. And I would just say the reason I keep at it, for sure, as Jonathan said, the relationships I now have, I would never change my life. And I feel why, like, whiteness to me feels like a death cult. And I'm clear, like, I want to be liberated and free with others. And so it feels like you couldn't pay me $1 million to do anything differently, because I've felt the transformation of what it might mean to have all of us, including myself, you know, experience liberation. And so it's like, it's so delicious that I want to go there no matter what, even when it's really difficult and even when I'm tired.
Do you get invited to a lot of dinner parties, Jennifer?
Maybe. Not since March, though.
You know, we've got about 5 minutes left, and this is a question that I'm asking of myself, and I really want to hear from you guys. And that is, what do you hope will be the outcome of this 2020 version of racial awakening? Because, you know, we've had several of these iterations throughout the years where there's some major thing that has happened that has turned the country on its ear, and we make a little bit of progress and then it goes back. And so this is the new 2020 version. What do you want to come out of this? Jonathan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that for me, the fact that we could have a sustained commitment to this work, so we're not bouncing from crisis to crisis, we go from Charlottesville to the next thing, I think is an opportunity. I'm also really struck by the calls that are really being driven by leaders of Black Lives Matter and folks who are really on the ground doing some of the important activism work to say, in Virginia, for example, we want to go from the statues to the statutes. This is about going deeper than symbols to really interrogate the structures. I think there are folks, and you can have different opinions, and I imagine your listeners do, about police and defund the police and those types of things. The fact that that's even on the table as a conversation now with some folks who I would never expect to be open to that conversation is, I think, a real opportunity for us to interrogate some of the things that were taken as givens in the past and are now being called into question. So to me, if we could really work at that level, at the systemic level, to look at policies and practices, structures, traditions, and to advance new changes that would help to promote equity, justice, inclusion, I think that's really where we could see some sustained change here.
Okay. Jennifer, what do you think? What do you want to come out of this 2020 version of our racial awakening?
That we do not stop. We do not stop. And echoing Jonathan, that all of the policies, the statutes, the practices, all of that continues to become our focus and remain our focus. And ultimately, I would like to see, massive reparations, systemic interventions in sort of multi-generational wealth inequity, resource redistribution, so that literally at some point, if I wake up in the morning, race no longer is an indicator of one's well-being relative to wealth, income, public health, any of that. Because we've created such a just, equitable society by those concrete transformations, including resource redistribution, that we literally could be a pluralistic nation and just celebrate that the beauties of difference without difference indicating sort of likelihood of various kinds of social experiences.
Absolutely. All right, we got 2 minutes left. I want to give one suggestion to each of our audience about how to start a conversation about race. We only have 1:30. So, Jonathan, go. You go first.
I think we're taught as white people that it's worse to say the wrong thing than it is to say nothing at all. I think that needs to be rethought. And so a big part of this is entering into the conversation. If you screw up, sticking with it, listening deeply, reflecting internally, and as we've said over and over, committing to making it more than a one-time conversation.
Absolutely. That's Jonathan Zur, President and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And Jennifer, you have the last word.
Show up, join a Black-led organization in your community. Show up there and just listen and learn and do the work that is asked of you in that space. It will change your life, and commit to yourself that you're going to stay.
Absolutely. That's Dr. Jennifer Harvey, author of Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And thank you, my audience, for listening to this conversation. I know for some of you, it was a tough conversation to hear, but it was a necessary conversation. And if there are others that you feel would benefit from the conversation, send them over to the anotherviewradio.org website and to download today's show or any other Another View program. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. We're on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter at Barbara Ham Lee. Next week on Another View, A Mother's Cry. Hear the heart-wrenching stories of African-American mothers and their sons and how they are doing during this racial pandemic. And I also want to take a moment to really implore everyone to please continue to social distance, continue to wear your mask outside, continue to wash your hands frequently. The coronavirus pandemic has not gone away, and we must continue to try to stay safe and to bring down the numbers. If you look in Hampton Roads, our numbers are escalating, and this is serious, folks. So please wear your mask, wash your hands for at least 20 seconds, and stay 6 feet apart from folks, and try to stay safe. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Todd Washburn is our audio engineer, and Dr. Barry Graham answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Stay safe, everybody, and join us again next Thursday at noon for Another View.